So, this is one of the weirdest pieces of history that I have to discuss. Because whenever I'm asked, was anyone in history treated like Voldermort in the Harry Potter series? I.e., where people were afraid to even mention their name. There is only one person who comes to my mind. One person who the enemies of whom do not refer to by name. They don't. The Royal Navy doesn't refer to this officer by his name. He is simply the Admiral. In the entire history of the Royal Navy, there has never been someone who has struck so much fear into their senior officers, as this one French officer. Every other time it's their name and they're talked about, and most of the time they're even joked about. But Suffren, he is known as the Admiral, and you respect him. And what's really kind of weird, when we consider it, is that for an officer who is quite so interesting in terms of his capabilities and his career, the Royal Navy doesn't necessarily send its best to go and take him down because they can't afford to. So you never get that matchup of the best of the Royal Navy versus the best of the French Navy, because he is off dominating the Indian Ocean. He is off making it seem like later on, when the reason why Napoleon thinks he has a chance is because of Suffren's history in the Indian Ocean. So surely Napoleon would have a chance. Suffren is an absolutely amazing admiral in so many ways, by managing to achieve so much with so little. However, as John Knox Lawton put it in his studies in naval history, a more scrupulous man might have respected the neutrality of Portuguese harbour. A less audacious one might have shrunk from thrusting his squadron in amongst a fleet that, in guns and men, far outnumbered his own. But scrupulousness and timidity were equally strangers to the character of Suffren, and that is his key. Pierre-André de Suffren lived 1729 to 1788, served 1743 to 1788. And in those 45 years of service, he builds up a reputation. I'd say his naval battles are more what his reputation comes from. So the book I'm using for this, and I'm using a lot of this in this work, is because it's one of the best studies that still has been done on Suffren, in my opinion, in capturing especially the emotions he managed to produce in the Royal Navy with his effective capabilities. It's actually a very old book. It's a very old book. It was published just under 100 years originally after he died. This is the modern version of it. I have parts of an older copy. I've never managed to find a complete version of the older copy, but you might know that I did my PhD at King's College London. That's where I did my PhD. And I'll explain a bit more about that, about the PhD and why I talk about it much in the Shameless book plug bit, so we don't get off topic, but some people seem to find it distressing, but there's a reason for it. And there, the Chair of Naval History is called the Lawton Chair of Naval History, after John Knox Lawton, who was the first Professor of Naval History at King's College London, and who basically is the father of modern naval history studies. And the guy who Mahan, Corbett, all these people sort of modelled themselves on is John Knox Lawton. And he wrote this wonderful book, which you can buy a modern version of, and it has all sorts of interesting people in there to look at. If I give you a list, it's got Jean de Vienne, it's got Colbert, de Cassin, Lebel de Suffren, of course, who gets a whopping 54 pages. Tegethoff, Privateers and Privateering number 1, Fortunate Wright. Number 2, George Walker. Then there's French Privateers, and they've got Jean Bart, Duguay Turenne, and of course Thoreau. He's got a section on Paul Jones, and he's got Robert Surcouf. It is well worth a read. It is an absolutely fantastic book, and it's still okay. Yes, we now know more. We have managed to gather more information, put together other sources, bring together different pieces of evidence. But it's worthwhile reading because it is a foundational source of the studies. And a lot of the studies we have today are reactions to this. And it's always worthwhile to go back and look at what the original historians who are writing about these things were writing and what they wrote. Because then you can see how the thought and how the history, as in the study of the history, and the way it's talked about has evolved over time. But again, I'll talk about this more in Shameless Book Plug session. Which is always a bit where I get to say thank you to everyone. Anyway, so how did he earn this? How did he earn this status? How did he earn this understanding? Well, quite simply, it comes from the fact that he's very, very good at fighting and very good at strategy. And his early career really doesn't show off what he becomes. So we're going to do this video by talking through, really, and I will say this, really, we're talking through 6 of his battles. We're talking through the Battle of Porto, Praya, the Battle of Sadra, and the Battle of Providence, and the Battle of Negapatam, the Battle of Trincomalee, and the Battle of Curlo. And these are all really very skilled approaches of someone who is making the most of the infrastructure and limited supplies he has. And some of those battles are inconclusive. Some of them are draws. Some of them are strategic wins and tactical losses. In other words, they're complicated. They are complicated. But very rarely does he fail to achieve what he is aiming for on a strategic level. And this is why he's quite so dangerous. Our French admirals often fail on their strategic level, on a strategic level. They often get distracted. They are trying to do one thing and they get distracted by fighting the Royal Navy, and maybe they win the battle sometimes, but often they lose because they are caught in a way they're not positioned to fight. And they're frustrated. They don't achieve their strategic goals. Suffren consistently keeps achieving his strategic goals. In many ways, the power of France in the Indian Ocean reaches its peak when he is out there, when he is out in charge. And now let's start off with the Battle of Porto Praya. Now, whilst I'm again going to quote from this wonderful source, this book, after a career of extraordinary activity and incident, after 38 years almost uninterrupted sea service, whether in the French Navy or in the Maltese cruisers, he was now appointed to a command in which he would be able to reduce to practice the rules which the hard chances of war had taught him. He had, indeed, unexampled opportunities of studying the higher part of his profession, engaged in almost every naval action that had been fought since the time of his childhood. Twice a prisoner in the hands of enemy, for nearly 5 years captain of a ship forming part of an experimental squadron, it is difficult to imagine a series of lessons more adapted to qualify a courageous and determined man, a zealous and intelligent officer for independent command. Such a man, such an officer, so schooled was Suffren, when at the age of 52 he was appointed to command of the East Indian Squadron. Now, here is the point I would really like to make about this. In this period, in the 18th century, we are often talking about the fact that the French Navy are constantly fighting the fact that they've lost a lot of their institutional memory. They lose this first through the removing of the Huguenots, And that takes about 40% of their officer corps and possibly 30% of their NCOs. And quite a large pool of their sailors, because the Huguenots hadn't had much success in the army. They're French Protestants, but they were allowed in the navy, because out of sight, out of mind, and frankly, they're prepared to serve. So they'd formed up a huge amount of the navy's experience, and a lot of the senior officers, and they'd been got rid of. Combine that with then the legacy of the British blockades, the Royal Navy's blockades of their fleets, and you suddenly get less and less sea time. And later on, of course, you then have the Revolutionary Wars, and during the revolutions, again, a lot of French senior officers find themselves executed or removed from position, or just getting out of Dodge before they have either of those things done to them. All this adds up to a French Navy which is constantly, chronically short of experienced, skilled, capable personnel at every single level. Suffren is the exact opposite, therefore, of what we find in a large number of officers, especially their senior officers. He has, through where he's been deployed and fortune and a healthy dose of luck and volunteering, actually been heavily employed and heavily utilized, and has built up a lot of experience. This means he's on a par with his counterparts. Now, on his way down, he's deployed to the India Squadron. He is sailing with his squadron. They need water. One of their ships hasn't got enough water, so they head into Porto Praya, which is a Portuguese port, and finds in there an English squadron. Now, the English squadron is under command of Commodore Johnston, and is sailing south to the Cape of Good Hope, to basically Cape Colony, with the aim of taking it over. Because, once again, the British have found themselves in a conflict with the Dutch, and the Cape Colony is always attractive. But the thing is, Johnston didn't expect anyone to be there. And Suffren was escorting his own troop colonies, but he needed water. Some of his ships needed water. So he was coming into Porto Praya, and he spots that Johnston has managed to muck up. Johnston has positioned the ships so that the warships are all surrounded by merchant ships, by their troop colonies, by other vessels. The warships can't fight. The warships aren't on the outer positions holding them with the ships on the... They're all just watering. No thought was applied. Johnston had done an absolutely terrible job. He had. And if he hadn't had the political connections he had, he'd have probably been in a lot more danger than he was. And this is what is said, as we discussed, Suffren hasn't got the force to take on the fight. He hasn't got the numbers on his side. He hasn't got position on his side. He still comes charging in. He attacks. And he causes a huge amount of damage. And yes, the ships that are captured are mostly recovered. And it's an inconclusive fight. But the thing is, the British lose coordination. The British lose organisation. The British lose a lot of the advantages they had been. And broadly speaking, it's only two of Suffren's ships, which actually do come in properly. The rest of his ships sort of don't anchor properly. And they sort of drift out. But the two ships which do a huge amount of damage to the Royal Navy. Huge amount of damage. And as a result, Suffren managed to get his squadron and troop convoys to the Cape of Good Hope by the 21st of June and the 30th of June, respectively. And spends a month there, refitting. Leaves 500 of his troops behind to help protect the Dutch colony. And then proceeds on to Ile-de-France. And now, of course, Ile-de-France is modern-day Mauritius. That's where he's heading for. Ile-de-France. Because that was a French colony. And that's where he's going to be his operating base. In contrast, well, Johnston's squadron, which had been equivalently, if not more powerful, especially once you consider that it had 5 ships of the line. 5 solid ships of the line. Okay, yes. The Suffren squadron is 5 third rates, 2 74s and 3 64s. Whereas the British one is 2 74, a 64 and 3 50s. But he also has 3 32 gun frigates. He has some armed transports, which look like more 4th rates, at least. And, you know, he has some other battleships there to fight. And theoretically, that should have given him an advantage. It should have made it look at least like he's capable of putting on a threat and putting on a fight. And there's a whole load of East Indiamen as well, which are also armed. So lots of ships in this squadron are armed. They have weaponry. They have capability. But they've been completely mashed up. They had been. And when Johnson arrives at Cape Colony, he arrives in July. He goes to Saldanha Bay. Managed to take some Dutch East Indies vessels as prizes then. And returns to the UK. Because he's lost. And he knows he's lost. He knows exactly what he's lost and how he's lost. And that is the beginning of Suffren's Eastern Indian Squadron adventure. Now, I always have to admit, it's these battles which are what make me laugh when we call this the American Revolutionary War. Because naval battles between Britain and France, taking place in the Indian Ocean, fighting for control of India, are sometimes grouped by historians into the period of the American Revolutionary War. And you sit there and go, no, the American Revolutionary War might have been one of the reasons, one of the excuses given for France getting involved, but there is no reason for fleet actions and for all the deployments that are going into India, apart from the French desiring to control India, and the British desiring to control India, for the fights to take place in those waters. There is nothing to do with America going on here. South America, if they were going after the silver trade in South America, that's an interesting thing. That could perhaps be justified, but yeah, Indian Ocean fights, no. The Battle of Sadras, this is an interesting operation. This is realistically a very interesting operation, and this is against Edward Hughes, who's the Royal Navy commander out in the Indian Ocean. Vice Admiral at this point. And he is competent, but I wouldn't call him startling. He's the example of what you would probably expect to find with a British deploying to station. Someone who will do the job and shouldn't lose a lot. He's not going to play too many risks, but he's also not going to make too many mistakes. And this battle, well, the French are sailing out from their islands. They're sailing out from Ile-de-France. After the forces had appropriately gathered there, they'd sailed on to India. They'd first started out with another person actually in command. They found a more senior officer at Ile-de-France who had taken over command, but he died. So Thomas d'Estaing d'Ilva is dead. And so Suffren is left in complete command. He sails for Madras. His plan is to surprise the British there. He's hoping the British are going to be surprisable. But Hughes, as said, Hughes is not a startling commander in the Royal Navy, but he's not a bad one. He finds the fleet anchored at Madras on the 15th of February 1782, and he finds them well ordered and well organised. So instead of trying a surprise attack, he decides to sail south to try and land his troops at Porto Novo, with the aim of marching up the coast to recapture various French and Dutch holdings on the way. Holdings which have been captured by the British in the course of the conflict. Now, Suffren has a problem. He has to protect his troop convoy. He has to protect it from Hughes. Now, Hughes has a problem. He only has 9 ships aligned to Suffren's 11. That's not really helpful. That is really not helpful, because if he wants to try and get round Suffren to get at his fleet, he needs to have enough ships. If he wants to get round Suffren to get at that transports, he needs to have enough ships to draw Suffren away. And again, Suffren's fleet is made up of 9 third rates, the vast majority of which are 64s. There are 3 74s in the whole force. And there are 2 50-gun fourth rates. So the vast majority of his force is third rate, but it's third rate 64s. For the Royal Navy, again, the vast majority of their force is third rates. Some of them considered fourth rates, but mostly they're 64s. Mostly they're 64s. They have a couple of 74s and a 50. But the others are 64s and even a 68 gunship. But the trouble is, the Royal Navy has 9 ships. The French have 11. So they have more powerful ships, they have more ships. And this is a problem. This is a problem for the Royal Navy, especially in this scenario. So what happens? How does this all work out? And you have to remember, the Suffren doesn't have anyone else. When you look through his ships, they're all commanded by captains. He's the only admiral out there. He's got no other senior officers to work with. He was supposed to be the second admiral. He is the chef d'escadre. He's supposed to be the second in command, not the commander. The fight is rather short, with Hughes trying to chase him down. And they do have a fight, but Suffren's ships didn't necessarily form line of battle. He consistently has issues with his captains, and people sometimes complain he doesn't build a band of brothers. It's very difficult in the French system. It's very difficult because you have officers of a range of skill sets who have been put in charge, and they don't have necessarily the same commonality of ethos which you will find in the Dutch Navy or the Spanish Navy or the Royal Navy, in that they could have been recruited under different measures. Because of the shortage of officers they keep creating with the various issues going on, internal issues, you have some officers who have wildly different approaches to naval warfare and to their view of their responsibilities and their role in naval warfare than others. In the Royal Navy, if an officer doesn't engage, he'd better have a bloomin' good reason. A very good reason. You were talking about a navy which has literally hanged admirals for failure to engage an enemy who was on grounds that not unreasonable for them not to engage. The French are more, well, you know, the wind was bad. The wind was bad. And this means, again, despite Suffren managing to beat his way past, despite Suffren managing to be successful in terms of taking his troops to where he wanted to go, and him actually managing to meet with Hyder Ali, the Mysorean, the ruler of Mysore, he actually has to chastise his captains after the battle because they don't get involved. And whilst they do have some fights, it is quite an interesting fight. The battle is just 3:30 till night, and it's some desultory bombardments against each other, realistically, with the French firing first and trying to remain in contact, and some vessels are nearly sunk. The Exeter, for example, the Royal Navy, wasn't sunk because the ships were recalled to line. There's a whole sort of discussion about why. I'd say, honestly, if you leave the British with a more severely damaged ship, it hampers them far more than actually losing a ship. Losing a ship means they don't have to do anything to recover it. A hampered ship means they have to recover it. And the thing is, as soon as Suffren gets to where he's going, lands his troops, he then tries to sail to hunt down Hughes. Hughes sails for Trincomalee, Ceylon, and makes repairs there. modern day Sri Lanka. And so, they are preparing for round 2 of the Hughes versus Suffren fights. This was a battle which took place on that trip to Trincomalee, because whilst Hughes is encumbered by a convoy this time, he is, and Suffren isn't. Suffren is trying to chase them down. They have a fight. It's an interesting contest in that Suffren theoretically should have the advantage, but his own command structure is falling apart. And he manages to bring to the fight a total of 12 ships of the line to take on 11. That's a fairly decent force. That is a fairly decent force. And again, he's got advantages. The British have equal numbers of 74s as him. They both have 3. But whereas Suffren only has 150 gun 4th rate and 154 gun 4th rate. The rest of it is being 64 gun 3rd rates. Hughes, well, technically you should say he has an advantage in that he has more 64s and only 150 gun 4th rate out of the rest of his ships. But the fact is, he has less ships overall, and so Suffren has an extra 50 gun 4th rate. Now, is that much of an advantage? Not particularly, but it depends on how you use it. And considering that Suffren is free of convoy, whereas Hughes isn't, he should have been able to use it well. And again, they keep attacking, but again, Suffren finds his own second-in-command, as the senior captain who's acting as second-in-command, is not really doing what he's supposed to. Really not doing what he's supposed to do. And he's got multiple ships disobeying his orders. In fact, that's a constant theme we have to deal with for Suffren, is a constant theme of people not listening and taking to his orders. But still, this fight is short, but it's vicious. And again, it causes the British a lot of trouble. Is it satisfactory to Suffren? No, but let's consider this. He has in quite quick order fought 3 battles. 2 battles in very quick order, chasing down the British. He's competing for dominance. He is pushing for dominance. And this is something he can never really get his squadron on board with. He can never really get the personalities he was dealing with on board with, because honestly, his captains are such a mixed group of people who have different styles. They would be perfect captains if you were... Some of them would be perfect captains if you were talking about the Mediterranean Fleet for the Royal Navy, or if you were talking about the Western Squadron for the Royal Navy, etc. They have their different styles. What realistically, if you're comparing it to British formations, you need for Suffren's style of command is what you would have in the Mediterranean Fleet for the Royal Navy. The kind of captains they want to put into that formation. Highly aggressive, highly motivated, highly self-engaging. To an extent, what also the Royal Navy found started to spread through its wider force. But whereas with the French, what you've got under Suffren are officers who are mostly going, we fight in line, we fight to this standard, we fight to this. We're not deviating. And Suffren does deviate. Suffren is about adapting to your enemy's weaknesses and taking advantage of them. Suffren is about not giving your enemy a chance. And this doesn't work with their style. It doesn't work with their thought process. But, Shameless book plug time. And then we'll continue on with the Battle of Negapatam. I'll get it right by the time. I promise. I'll keep trying. Now, this is the part of the video where I say thank you for liking, sharing, subscribing, helping the channel grow. Thank you for all the things you do to support the channel. The Ko-fis, the Super Chats, Super Thanks, memberships, Patreon, all those things. Thank you. And speaking of Patreon, the suggestions for November should be live now. I'm also said I'd explain a bit about why I use my PhD as much, because It comes up occasionally, people ask, and as the channel grows, people ask again. Okay? So, as I've said in many videos, I don't think you need a PhD to be a historian. I really don't. Being a historian as a career predates being able to get a PhD. There again, though, getting able to get a PhD and being called doctor for it predates actually there being medical doctors. So, you know, these are all the fun things you have if you can start looking back in history. And I do think you need a medical degree to be a medical doctor. Strongly think that. But being a historian, there are some very good historians I know who do not have PhDs. There are also some very, very bad ones I know who do have PhDs, and I'm regularly tempted to try and ask about it if I can see their PhD thesis and check it. We'll leave that to one side. With me, the reason I promote myself and talk about myself with my PhD is because for me it was a massive achievement. You see, when I was younger at school, I was told, because of my dyslexia, that I would never amount to anything. That as smart as I was, as good as I was at taking tests and all these things, I would fail at anything I did. I would fail because ultimately, being dyslexic meant I was stupid. I didn't agree with this. I was told specifically I would never get a degree. Never be able to achieve university because standards are so much tougher there. Well, standards are tougher in university, I do agree. I'm sometimes involved in setting those standards and making sure they are the same for everyone. And it sometimes feels a bit cruel, because you do realise that there are a lot of exceptional circumstances, but there's only so much grace you can give before it becomes unfair on the other students you're holding to those standards. So you have to sometimes go, no. And then you ask the student usually to repeat the course or something like that. However, with that all being said, I got my PhD. I went and got a PhD. Basically because I was stubborn and told I couldn't do it. And my policy has always been, if you tell me I can't do something and it is legal, I will do it. If it is within my power, I will do it. And that's it. So I'm kind of proud of it, because I was told I would never get anything. But I got a PhD from the War Studies Department of King's College London. I studied under Professor Andrew Lambert, who is one of the nicest and greatest historians you'll ever meet. I got to meet so many very cool historians while doing it. And that has served to give me, in many ways, the confidence to do what I do now. Which I do have to say, I do find it funny when people accuse me of being smug. Because to me, being smug would mean that you believe you know everything. And I start from the basic point of view, I do not know anything. In fact, I firmly believe that the moment you stop wanting to learn and stop thinking you should learn more is the moment you should stop teaching and stop doing stuff like this. Because there is always more to learn, there's always more information to learn, and more stuff to take on board. And it's worthwhile doing. I know. That's me. That's my little bit of history. Let's get back to Suffren. He's far more interesting. But again, thank you for your support of the channel, and thank you for helping it grow. Now, this was one of those battles where, again, we can call it an inconclusive battle. We really can. To an extent, the French are trying to deliver on what the ruler of Mysore especially wanted. He wanted Negapatam. Now, Negapatam is a major port in this period. It's a really critical port as well. And whilst they've taken other areas, and they have managed to be quite successful, well, Sir Hector Munro had managed to take Negapatam in 1781, and the Royal Navy and the British East India Company, and, well, pretty much every other part of the British government and British system out there, were really loath to lose it. Really loath to lose it. And so they meet. The fleets meet. This time they're unencumbered by convoys. You have 11 ships of the line and a frigate under Hughes. You have 12 ships of the line, a frigate, a corvette, and a fireship under Suffren. And realistically, when Suffren is forming up his battle line and trying to organise everything, he is dealing with things being chucked at him by both his commanders and by the lack of resources he has available to him. For example, on the 5th of July, he stopped being able to have a fight because Ajax, which was not necessarily one of his most reliable ships, under the command of the very interesting Bouvet-Précourt, had a sudden squall, which caused its main and mizzen topmast to collapse. The squall calmed, the breeze was then to Hughes' advantage, giving him the windage, and that meant he could sail into Hughes could sail into his anchorage in Negapatam itself and be fairly secure, with the two fleets anchoring 2 cannon shots apart. If they'd fired at each other, the cannon would have had some splashdown area. On the 6th of July, Suffren wakes up to find that during the night, Bouvet-Précourt hadn't repaired his ship, and actually, he wanted to retreat. Now, I think Suffren here shows great restraint, because whereas I feel someone like Admiral Duncan would have gone aboard the Ajax, and probably physically picked up Bouvet-Précourt, and chucked him as far as he could off the ship, to see just how far he could throw him, Suffren doesn't do that. Suffren just refuses, because battle's imminent, and orders his line to bear down on the British line for close action. Ajax stands away and will not join the action. Now, Ajax, if you're wondering, what is this ship? How important is it to his formation? Well, Ajax is a 64-gun, third-rate ship of the line. A 64-gun. So, yeah. She matters. She matters to this. Especially in this operation, it is 64s. This is the fight. At 09:30 hours, the fleet opens fire on each other at long range. The Flamand engaged both the Hero and Exeter. Animal engaged Isis. Sadra faced off against Burford. Brilliant focused on Sultan. Heros and Superb, the 2 flagships, decide to engage each other quite happily. And the remainder of the British lines just, well, not able to line up directly against the French, so they just fire at what they can. Whilst the French... how do I put this? The French Sphinx and Monaca did barely anything, realistically. So unsurprisingly, the Flamand, which was being engaged with both Hero and Exeter, took significant damage. Can't think why that happened. But was able to keep up the fight well and do well. Brilliant. Well, she suffered under the fire of Sultan, but Suffren managed to get Heros to come to her rescue. And that was quite a useful thing. But again, please note that his reserve is his own ship. That's the one vessel he can realistically rely on. By 1300 hours, the wind changed. Both lines collapse into confusion, realistically. And again, this is the point where if you had French captains who were actually delivering on the capabilities they were offered, rather than thinking, hang on, we deployed to the Indian Ocean, so we thought we weren't going to actually have to fight here, you might have had some actually interesting actions take place. As it was, 4 British and 2 French ships turned towards each other. The British ships were Burford, Sultan, Worcester and Eagle. The French were Sèvres and Brilliant. Sèvres finds herself fighting Sultan and possibly Worcester and Burford. But the thing is, whilst they claim that happens, and they claim that it's the arrival of Suffren which managed to help them fall back, The fact is, we know Brilliant was being engaged by Worcester and Eagle. So Worcester was possibly fighting both sides, but if she was, that is a really, really amazing feat, considering the crew she's got, to be fighting both sides. But pretty much again, it is Suffren coming to the rescue in Heros. They reform their lines, but neither fleet's able to adopt battle positions, and Suffren, frankly, is at the point of going, "What have I got here? Are you Frenchmen or are you cowards?" Quite honestly, they should have shouted out, "We are cowards. We are trying to give France a bad name." Not sure, but, you know, there are arguments that they didn't like his command style, that he didn't give them enough reward, enough praise, but honestly, it's hard to see how you can reward someone when they're actually falling out of battle and not doing their jobs. I mean, you don't do that. You don't give them praise then, they don't deserve it. The really interesting thing was the British fleet was in a far worse material state. They're utterly incapable of preventing or pursuing the French. They have really been fought to a standstill, but mostly it's by very much a handful of the French ships which were well handled and were following their admiral's instruction and lead. The rest of the ships were just, well, they were also there, I suppose. It's nice to have them there. Maybe their moral support. At this point, Suffren, and I can't think why, but he decides to take Mbouvier and take away his command of Ajax. He arrested 3 others for their transgressions during the battle, and the previous 2. M. de Kilbart, the commander of Sèvres, had to strike colours during one of the post-school engagements, but yeah, he tried to anyway. His subordinates prevented him. Suffren was not sure why he was surrendering during the battle they were winning. He didn't understand that. I can understand and accept this. Could you understand that? Would you surrender during a battle you're winning? No. You just ask for more biscuits and carry on fighting. And after that, well, Suffren sailed to Cudlaw to try and effect repairs. Hughes, well, he spends 2 weeks trying to position himself and reorganise his fleet and get them actually into fighting condition. Again, the trouble is you find with both the British commanders and the French captains is that a lot of them didn't expect there to actually be serious fighting taking part in the Indian Ocean. They didn't expect there to be serious fighting going on. Why would the French send a fleet over here? This is not the path of the war, surely. Well, to be fair, the British had expanded it by taking over French and Dutch territory quite happily, but, you know, no one expects the French to actually come and turn up in the Indian Ocean. No one expected them to, but they did. And that's why, at the Treaty of Paris in 1783, Negapatam is ceded permanently by the Dutch to Britain. It worked out for the British in the end. Then we have the Battle of Trincomalee. Now this battle, this was even worse, because you see, he brought his fleet back to their harbour, they managed to get repaired, and, you know, they were anchored outside of Trincomalee, and they were being sort of organised, and Hughes comes to chase them. And Suffren has a council of his captains. And his second in command, the senior captain he has other than him, who consistently opposes offensive actions against the British with such vigour, the man must be the most active coward ever to be. Even when they have strength, he's either a coward or he's been so conclusively defeated by the Royal Navy, in his head, he cannot conceive of fighting them and winning. He cannot conceive of it. And so the vast majority of Suffren's captains, the ones left, remember he's got rid of a few of them. And so Suffren ends up overruling them, and they go to sea. The French fleet outnumbers the Royal Navy. They outnumber the Royal Navy in weight of shot, they outnumber the Royal Navy in terms of ships. They have huge advantages on land from their Mysorean allies. So he sails out to fight the Royal Navy. They exit harbour. He orders them to form battle line. To say it is poorly executed by his subordinates would be to make it seem like it was in any way actually properly executed. Suffren orders them to hold fire until close quarters, and he tried to communicate this by firing a gun from Heros. The captains all misinterpreted this as the order to open fire, and so they begin firing at long range, which is what the French like to do at this point. A lot of their commanders, they like to engage at long range and, hope it stays at long range, because closing with the British, whilst it gives you most chance to be most devastating and to use your numerical advantage to your strength, does also carry the greatest risks. Now, the heaviest action that does take place is in the centre of the line. And that's where Suffren and Hughes face each other again. Heros is assisted by the Illustra and the Ajax. Hughes is aboard the Superb and is assisted by Burford, Sultan, Eagle, Hero, and Monaca. And, the fight rages on. When you consider, literally, it's 3 versus 6. It goes on for an hour before Suffren calls for assistance. The San Michael and the Annabelle stayed away. The Brilliant slowly nears action to give some assistance. Remember, this is the same ship which had been saved in its previous action by Suffren. And, the Ajax is then forced to withdraw after taking heavy damage. It's replaced by the Artesian. Then the Heros mainmast comes crushing down. Suffren is forced to make sure that the British do not think he'd strike his colours. Actually, I think he's more worried about the other French ships thinking he struck his colours, because literally, he's got captains out there who had struck their colours in a previous battle when they were winning, were striking their colours and were only stopped by their subordinates. So, if they think he's striking his colours, they're gone. He also ran out of ammunition at certain points and continued to fire powder alone to try and fool the enemy and to try and keep his own ships fighting. By the end of the battle, it has theoretically gone more in favour of the French. The Isis, the Worcester, Monmouth were all badly damaged. Exeter's captains being killed in action was disabled, but it's after 3 hours of battle the winds change. The French fleet now has the advantage, and the ships on the outer end of the line start to close in, and Hero loses her mainmast, Worcester loses her main top posts, and the British ships are sort of being disabled before night falls and darkness ends the battle. It's literally darkness. And honestly, the fact that the French ships weren't fighting anymore. For the British, the British are bashed up, but they haven't lost anything. They've managed to keep it safe. They haven't lost any ships. They've still got the 12 ships of the line. 51 dead, 283 wounded. But for the French, you have the fact that for the van squadron, Artesian had engaged at a certain point, but otherwise, when you start looking at the rest of the ships, the Severin and Sir Michael had assisted. The Orion, a 74-gun ship, had done virtually nothing, and the Brilliant had been slightly involved. The Centre Force, the Petite Annibale, had 0 killed and wounded or wounded, so does Sphinx. Heros and Lustra, they have taken a massive chunk of their force. And then you go down, you look at the losses and you're going, okay, I can tell which ships were heavily involved in this fight. And once again, Suffren is frustrated by his own commanders. Once again, he's frustrated. He's trying to do tactics which, let's be honest, were what Duncan did at Camperdown, what other officers have done. And yet, he doesn't do it. He can't execute it because of his officers. His own officers. Which leads us to the Battle of Cuddalore, which was a French victory. It was. And what's different this time? Well, Suffren's outnumbered. He's outnumbered. He's no longer got the advantage of numbers, and he wins. Now, the Battle of Cuddalore is also probably one of the more traditional battles that Suffren fights. And why do we call it a French victory when there's no ships captured, there's no ships sunk? It's literally 15 ships of the line versus 18. Well, it's because that after the battle, Hughes is forced to withdraw. He'd lost ships damaged in the battle, he'd had ships damaged from scurvy, he was short on water, and so Suffren manages to hold Cuddalore, hold his position, forcing the supply fleet to withdraw, and he managed to add personnel to support the defence there, and pretty much it manages to weaken the besieging British to the point at which the British end up being forced to withdraw. Now, how does he get this to happen? How does he get these things to work? He manages to get 1,200 troops embarked on his ships. He does this to increase the gunnery complement, but I'm fairly certain it was also to stiffen the resolve of some of his officers. It's always good to have some extra soldiers aboard the ships who have, let's say, a different loyalty than necessarily the crews they're part of. And it can serve as a zesty reminder to captains. And basically what happens is that Hugh does a line of battle, Suffren is the same, and they have an attack in line of battle. It's 3 hours of blasting each other. All the ships engage. There's no real fancy stuff, but it ends up being the nailed in the coffin for Hugh's fleet operations, which allows Suffren the victory he needs. And that's it. It's a grinding fight. It's a strategic fight, but it kind of fits with the pattern of the rest of his operations. We should have to consider his legacy because, sadly enough, after this war, and after his campaign in the Indian Ocean, all these successes and all the other fights he's fought, he goes home victorious. The Peace of Paris arrives and he heads home. And he's greeted with honour, with status. He is a capable officer. He arrives in Toulon on the 26th of March 1784, summoned straight to Versailles, and he is received by both Louis XVI and Castelier, the naval minister. They specifically create a fourth position of vice admiral, specifically for him, with a decree stipulating that it would be suppressed after he died. And then, after the tensions flare up again after 1787, with the implementation of the Eden Agreement, they thought a new conflict was emerging, and so Louis XVI orders the Brest Squadron to be readied and Suffren to command it. This is the greatest threat he can make to the Royal Navy, leaving him also the choice of his captains. He didn't have to take the captains he was found, he was able to choose his own captains. Unfortunately, he dies in Paris on the 8th of December 1788 before he'd been able to travel out there. And yes, Suffren is one of those greats of naval history who doesn't really get the attention he deserves. He really doesn't. He wasn't liked by the other captains. He demanded too much of them. He demanded they risk things. He demanded they chuck things into the fight. And he was considered a poor comrade-in-arms, bad-tempered. And these things are all true, but so was Admiral King. So are so many of the admirals in history and the senior officers, and sometimes they've still been good. And honestly, considering the performance of his ships, I can understand why Suffren was bad-tempered. I think if he has a fault, and it probably is quite a big one, is he expected everyone to be as brave, as insightful, and analytical as he was. I realise that some will write that his action is banal and disappointing. I have read the books about that. But the trouble is, what can you pull off with what you have? When he was younger, when he fought solar ships battles, he does really interesting things. But with the fleet he has available to him, he can't do interesting things. But the fact he pulls off what he does, when even his own captains are expecting to lose and are acting like that, you have to give him props. You have to give him props. Since he died, 8 ships of the Navy, of the French Navy, have been named Suffren. 8 ships. And he deserved it. I'm also mentally thinking of all the bad-tempered admirals in the Royal Navy in this period and how they did. Augustus Keppel, who of course had Duncan to act as the future Admiral Duncan to act as an interpreter and all those things. And I'm wondering if Suffren had been better served by his second-in-command, by his flag captains. If they had better served him, would he have a better legacy? Would he have been more successful? And I think, again, the problem comes down to the pool the French are drawing from. The pool of personnel they are drawing from. And the very real issues they have created with their own actions. With their own situation. I consider him not to be one who lacks diplomatic qualities, but possibly social graces. Possibly social graces. But he had the diplomacy down. He was very good with the Sultan Mysore and a few of the other leaders he dealt with. He was good at that. Anyway, this was Suffren. I always finish videos with a question, and I'm not going to change my habit now. With Pierre-André de Suffren, what I would like to ask you is this. Let's say he doesn't die in 1788, and there's no war then. There's no war till the French Revolutionary Wars break out. And I know his ashes were defiled in 1793 by French revolutionaries, which seems a bit cruel. But let's say he did survive. Let's say he did survive and he was still serving, because let's be honest, the French Revolutionary could do with a good admiral. The glorious 1st of June takes place in 1794, 6 years after he died. June 1694, or 1794 to be precise. And he would have been at the astounding age of 65 at that point, so not necessarily too old to command, and not necessarily too old to actually go to sea, and would have been still useful. Do you think someone like Suffren, with his choice of whatever captains are available at that point, could have done differently at the glorious 1st of June versus Richard Howe, instead of in the place of Villars de José? Do you think he would have been a better officer for that? There are a few other naval battles I do agree in terms of the War of the First Coalition. There are a few. But, yeah. That's, I'd love to hear what you think. Whether you think Suffren would have been an improvement over Villars de José at the glorious 1st of June. What he could have done with such a fleet. What could he have achieved with such a force? With that being said, let's consider what do we have coming next week. The CSS Arkansas and Isaac N. Brown. An interesting study on leadership. It is. Thank you very much for your support of the channel, for watching the channel, for liking, sharing, and subscribing, and helping it grow. Thank you for all you do for the channel. Take care, and hope you enjoyed the video.